3.
Alright, hey everybody, it's Saturday, March 28th, and we are headed out on another episode of Washington Wild and Woolly with Dr. Mark Swanson. I'm your host, and we're headed out from Pullman, Washington. We just passed through Colfax, and we're headed west on State Highway 26. We're going to head out to a place called the Juniper Dunes Wilderness. It's owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and we're going to go visit it as a special case of arid land ecosystems here in the Central Columbia Basin of Washington State. And I'm joined today by Jill behind the camera there.
Hello.
And then Sophie right here. Sophie, of course, is coming along. And then my cousin Meadow, she's in from out of town. She's in the back. Hey, Meadow. Awesome. So we're headed west here. We're still in the Palouse with its deep silt loam soils that grow an awful lot of the wheat and garbanzo beans produced in Washington State. Whitman County is the leading wheat producing county in the nation, actually. So that's a major land use, but these are very fine textured soils. And again, when you're considering ecosystems and their uses, you have to go to the geology. You have to go to the soils to really understand them. And the soils here were deposited by wind over the course of the Pleistocene and then the Quaternary era in which we are. And they're very fine textured soils because they got blown a further distance. So the coarser stuff tended to settle out closer to the Columbia River. So if you get into the interior Columbia Basin, close to the where the Snake and the Columbia come together at the Tri-Cities, you'll have much coarser wind-blown deposits, and those are sand dunes. So we actually have sand dunes that are pretty far removed from where you might expect them, coastal environments close to the ocean. So these sand dunes are a very special type of substrate, and we're going to go look at some of the specialized vegetation that occurs on the sand dunes of the interior Columbia Basin. Things like western juniper makes a very far north appearance here in Washington on those sand dune deposits. We've got bitterbrush, Persia tridentata, likewise, it's pretty far north for that species. And we've got some specialized plants like gray cryptantha leucophea, which is a small plant related to the Amsynchias. It's in the borage family, and this is a very rare plant. It's endemic to Washington. It only is found in sand dune environments, and so we're going to go take a look at this very specialized environment with highly dependent flora. So hope you all are excited for this episode of the lectures, the field lectures. Glad you all can join us. One other thing that came to mind as we're rolling along here is climate and how it interacts with these substrates. So it was raining back in Pullman. Remember, we're at 2,250 feet in Pullman, and so we're on the high side of the Columbia Basin before we go up into the northern Rockies. And of course, it's going to be cooler and moister there because any moisture that comes out across the Columbia Basin is going to get pushed up. It's going to cool. We're going to have condensation and precipitation. But the further we drive to the west into the heart of the Columbia Basin, the lower we're going to go. We're probably going to be only around 750 feet elevation today. And so we'll be in the heart of the rain shadow of the Cascades at a very low elevation. So we'll see more and more blue sky and less precipitation as we go today. In fact, if you look out ahead of the truck here, you can see that those clouds are already starting to break up. We're starting to see blue sky in between the clouds. And this is kind of characteristic of this whole rain shadow environment, that as you go into the heart of the Central Columbia Basin, it's just going to get more and more arid. Now, aridity, of course, is very important in terms of how plants respond to their substrate. So if you're over on the west side in the West Cascadian environment where you've got really abundant moisture, it really doesn't matter what kind of substrate you're on, almost. If you're on a sand, a gravel, you get enough moisture, it's going to override the influence of that well-drained substrate, as opposed to if you're on, say, a silt loam or something that can retain moisture more effectively. Over here in the basin, it's very different. Because we're already in an arid environment, substrate becomes much more strongly emphasized in terms of water relations. So if you get onto a sand or a gravelly substrate, you're going to see some real shifts in the vegetation because water is already at a premium in this dry environment. So a place like the interior Columbia Basin is a great place to examine the influence of substrate on vegetation because we're already in an environment where moisture is limiting and playing a role in terms of organizing the vegetation. Here's what you'll see as you pull over the last ridge and the juniper dunes come into view. In the foreground, we still have blue bunch wheatgrass, Pseudoregnaria steppe. But in the distance, you can see that the landscape pattern starts to change. You have open dune faces, and you can see some of the tall, dark crowns of western juniper on the horizon. Water is often the limiting factor for grazing in many locations, so ranchers will often need to create water sources like this one. We gained the edge of the wilderness, entered it via a fence. The fence is to exclude grazing from the wilderness area. And the first thing you see is a relatively high cover of the perennial bunch grasses in and amongst the sagebrush crowns. And then turning to the south, you can start to see the taller, darker crowns of the western juniper. On the right, you see some open dune faces there and a lot of gray and green rabbit brush as well in the landscape. All right, here we are a little bit closer to that open woodland of western juniper. You can see in the background here, it has still a very open woodland formation, but it's about the densest that we're going to find the western juniper here on this specialized substrate. Now notice we're on a north-facing slope here. We've got a little bit of a sand dune ridge here to our south. So here we have a little bit lower heat load and we can have a higher density of the western juniper. In other places, the juniper is only going to occur as scattered individuals, probably on specialized little cool or slightly moister microsites where it could establish and survive. Now, in the interstitial space between our western junipers, we have a mid-level stratum of basin big sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata, which is, again, the classic shrub of this interior Columbia Basin. Now, in the interstitial space between the shrubs, we have a ground stratum of grasses, and here it tends to be sand dropseed, Sporobolus cryptandrus, which we all saw in laboratory earlier in the term. And here on this specialized sandy substrate, the sand dropseed has increased relative to the other grasses of the region. For example, our blue bunch wheatgrass, Pseudoregnaria spicata, which is the most common grass in the shrub steppe in other parts of the basin. But here on this relatively coarser sandy substrate, we have more sand-adapted species of bunchgrass like our sand dropseed. We also have a number of other interesting plants here in these sand dune hills. One is going to be the veiny sorrel, Rumex venosus, which is an interesting, almost fleshy or succulent member of the sorrel genus. We also saw some beautiful members of the lily family, including Fritillaria pudica, which is nodding yellowbell, and you'll see pictures of that a little bit later. But here, on this very specialized substrate, we have some highly adapted species that really characterize the special sand dune environment. Right behind us here, we've got a very open dune face, and you can see that it's largely unvegetated because of the shifting nature of the substrate. It simply defies the ability of most species to establish there and remain on the unstable surface of the constantly moving sand dune. And on a windy day like today, you can appreciate the forces of wind that cause these dunes to be in a constant state of movement. These are very dry, very challenging environments as well. Plants need to constantly be able to reroot and take advantage of the sparse moisture that's available within the sand dune. But some species can, and you can see the species that is nodding that open sand dune face right there, and that is going to be our veiny sorrel, the Rumex venosus, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is a very succulent or very fleshy member of the genus Rumex, and it's highly adapted to these sandy substrates. There's another species of plant that it only occurs in these sandy environments in the very heart of the Columbia Basin, and that is Cryptantha leucophea, gray Cryptantha, which is a member of the borage family, and it is only found in these shifting sand dune substrates. And it has a very good ability to be able to reroot as the sand moves around it, so it can establish a new system as the sand in which it is rooted is on the move. We're on a south-facing slope here, and you can see it's a little more open. We don't have the junipers here, and here we've got some of that veiny sorrel right here, Rumex venosus. And over here we've got some basic big sagebrush still on the foot slope here where it has enough moisture. But as we move up, it shifts actually in terms of shrub composition to green rabbit brush, Chrysothamnus viscidiflorus here. And that's that shrub here that is on the mid slope here of the south facing portion of the sand dune. We also have some other interesting forbs here. This is Achillea millefolium, which is yarrow. It's woolly yarrow, so it's a subspecies that is adapted to these really xeric, sandy environments. And then of course we have a lot of the sand dropseed and other grasses here that are adapted to the sand dune environment as well. Here on the north side of a basin big sagebrush crown, which you can see right here, we have the beautiful site of a western juniper seedling. You can see it's got the relatively needle-like foliage that's characteristic of young juniper foliage, and it's been able to establish here in the shade of this basin big sagebrush. So the sagebrush is acting to facilitate the establishment and survival of this little seedling right here. And probably a bird that was dispersing the seed of the western juniper might have sat on a branch here in the basin big sagebrush and dropped that seed as it defecated, and it was able to establish. And there's Sophie investigating as well. We hiked over a few of the major dunes and found a large flat in between several of the larger dunes, and on this flat we found a special community of bitterbrush, Persia tridentata, which is built a lot like our sagebrush is, but it's actually a member of the rose family. It has beautiful little leaves that actually have 3 lobes, so it's also tridentate like our Artemisia tridentata is. So really it's structured quite a lot like sagebrush, and at a distance it might even resemble it, but once you get up close you can see that it is in fact a different species of plant. So instead of a western juniper and basin big sagebrush community, we have a western juniper bitterbrush community. So here's our bitterbrush right over here. You can see it's a relatively tall shrub, 6-7 feet in height here in this relatively protected basin, and it has a lot of the same adaptations that basin big sagebrush does, including relatively curly bark. So it's got bark that will shade the stem, keeping it cooler. Again, it's got smaller leaves that are also going to reduce the stressors associated with aridity. It's got a relatively complex crown that increases self-shading over the whole plant. So in a lot of ways, it has many of the same adaptations that basin big sagebrush does, but it's from a totally different family of plant. So the rose family as opposed to the aster family, which is where sagebrush is. So again, it's a good example of convergent evolution, where species from different genetic backgrounds really evolve a lot of the same adaptations to their stressful environment.
Here's a close-up view of western juniper, Juniperus occidentalis. The foliage is scale-like, decussate, and with white resin-like exudates. The yellow-brown structures you see here, about 2 millimeters in length, are pollen cones, or male cones. The pollen is going to be released shortly here in May. The female cones are gray-blue and are very commonly dispersed by American robin and a number of other birds and animals. So here in the juniper dunes, this is the furthest north extension of the range of this species, and it's here because of this relatively coarse, well-drained substrate. It's not just junipers that make this wilderness special. A number of shrubs and forbs not just survive, but thrive in the sand dune environment. We were lucky to catch pale wallflower, Erysimum occidentale of the mustard family, in full flower. Note the basal rosette of leaves, the reduced leaves upwards on the stem, the crowded raceme, and 4 petals per flower. Very characteristic of the mustard family. This beautiful herb with finely dissected leaves is spring parsley, Chimopterus terebinthinus of the carrot family. It grows in sandy or gravelly substrates in shrub steppe environments of the interior Columbia Basin and throughout the West. It is very similar to the genus Lomatium, the desert parsleys. Here are green and gray rabbit brush growing in close proximity to each other. As one climbs up out of the dune bottoms where you have the junipers and taller shrubs like the Artemisia growing together, you come to a zone that is dominated by green and gray rabbit brush. If you climb further up the dune to the more unstable surfaces, we transition away from shrubs altogether into an herb and grass dominated zone. So In these zones, you have strong zonation of the environment as a function of where you are relative to the dunes themselves. Common Yarrow, Achillea millefolium of the aster family, also grows here. A fairly woolly subspecies occurs in these sandy, harsh environments. Common Comandra, Comandra umbellata of the sandalwood family, occurs here. It is a plant that is generally restricted to sandy soils, regardless of moisture availability. It is hemoparasitic or partially parasitic on the roots of other plants. It also is a host for a rust fungus that can affect pines. Ground beetles are incredibly abundant here. Some of them are habitat specialists on sandy soils. You can see their tracks amply distributed across the surface of the sand dunes. Snow buckwheat, Eriogonum niveum, is one of the species adapted to life in our arid western lands and also on the crests of the sand dunes. It has many of the attributes of a sand dune plant: a dense hairy covering of stems and leaves, a rounded architecture, a low growth form, and a root system both deep and wide that can adapt to the shifting surfaces of the sands. Here's an example of sand dune stabilization by gray rabbit brush growing on the crest of a dune. So on your left is west, and the prevalent wind blows from the west to the east to the right. And you can see that the presence of this shrub is stopping that cutting action of the wind, removing sand from the left and moving it to the right. And furthermore, sand will accumulate on the lee side of that shrub. You also have below ground stabilization as well. Prairie June grass, Kilaria cristata, is one of the perennial bunt grasses that is much more abundant within the Juniper Dunes wilderness than in the Pseudoregnaria-dominated shrub steppe outside of the wilderness area and away from the sandy surfaces. At the crest of the dunes, the shrubs give way to herbaceous plants. These dynamic areas of rapidly shifting sand are characterized by a community of sand dune wheatgrass, veiny dock, and scurf pea. The wheatgrass and scurf pea in particular are very tightly associated with active sand dunes in the Columbia Basin. This part of the dune reminds me a lot of sand dune environments of the ocean shore. Plants here must have strong, deep root systems that are able to anchor the plant in the winds and in the shifting sands of these dune crest environments. Here Sophie takes a minute to lay down and survey her domain. Here's a picture of the scurf pea, Sorrelia lanceolata of the pea family. We weren't able to visit the dunes at a time when it was growing or flowering, but here's a good look at it in a photo taken by Dr. Ben Legler of the University of Idaho. And okay, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we're still in our discussion of the Juniper Dunes wilderness, and I'm really grateful to be joined today by Dr. David Gaylord. He's a professor emeritus from the School of the Environment at Washington State University, and his research career emphasized sedimentology, geomorphology, and quaternary climate change. And David, really nice to have you join us here on this video series. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, good to be here, Mark. And today we get an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is sand dunes and windblown silt. And in particular, that in the context of the remarkable story we have around here of the Scabland floods. So, well, we've got this first image up on the screen, and you can see, just so that we have this regional perspective, many of you are familiar with the so-called Missoula floods. We call them, really, they are mega floods because they are orders of magnitude larger floods than ever occur even in the largest river systems in the world. And back towards the end of the last glaciation, between about 17,500 years ago and 14,500 years ago, we had a big lake here by, that was Missoula. Modern day Missoula is just on the southern part of the lake. And it captured about 2,500 cubic kilometers of water in that lake. It was a Great Lake-sized lake that was held by, if we can see up here right at the Idaho-Montana border. Can you see that, Mark? Yeah, here we go. There was an ice dam, and this ice dam periodically became buoyant. There were 40 to 60 of these mega floods. that came across North Idaho, past Spokane, over by the Grand Coulee. And I've generalized that with this big white arrow here to show the direction of the transport of the floodwaters, which were moving at a maximum speed, probably about 60 miles an hour. But they inundated, they submerged the area under almost 1,000 feet of water. Now, as they were moving in this direction, they were transporting everything that had been dumped by the glaciers, because the glaciers were, the ice mass was north of Spokane, the northern part of Montana and Idaho. And it was carrying everything from glacial flour. If any of you who've ever seen the turquoise blue waters around modern glaciers would be familiar with this. So we call that rock flour, as well as sand and gravel. And all of this is being transported down here until it gets to a place just about on the Oregon-Washington border called Wallula Gap, which temporarily held the waters back. And we know this because we have iceberg evidence that's on the order of 1,000 feet above the modern Columbia River. When it did this, though, it deposited a lot of that sediment, and then the prevailing winds carry the sediment back towards the north and northeast. These would be prevailing southwest and northeast winds. As part of this, and I've located Pasco because we're interested in the Juniper Dunes. Juniper Dunes are just a little bit, just about where I've got the pointer right here. And they are part of an entire, if you will, an engine that drives the Luss machine, the windblown silt machine, that has created, and we'll see this in another image, this whole area over here would be part of the Palouse. Closer to that, though, would be sand dunes. The sand dunes have not moved that far. Again, I gave the ages of the floods as between about 17,500 and 14,500 years ago. The last at 14,500 years ago, then at that point, you were able to start having sand dunes that wouldn't be washed away by the next flood. And they start to migrate off here to the northeast. And we'll see the Juniper Dunes as one of that engine series of dune deposits. Now I say it's an engine because mixed with the sand that makes up the sand dunes is silt and clay. And when the sand particles start to bounce along the surface, they eject the silt and clay as dust clouds. And in fact, this whole process has been going on for over 1 million years. The last of the glacial outburst floods, mega floods, was that we've been able to document, the last of about 6 that we can document. There were undoubtedly other floods before that that extend beyond 1 million years ago. So the Palouse is the result of this long-term, if you will, process like a conveyor belt. You happen to be a sand grain, you get incredibly frustrated, or a silt grain, because about the time you moved up here, then another flood carries you back to where you started and you have to start again. If you're a silt or a clay grain, you get carried up here to the Spokane area and then ultimately picked up and transported down to Tri-Cities, and then you start all over again. So that's the big picture. And then we can look at what the dunes look like at the surface. It's a big lobate. I think of them as a blanket or a mantle of dune sand. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide that we have. And here are the Juniper dunes.
Question before we move on, David. So these outburst floods created substrates of vastly different textures, from boulders all the way down to the finest of rock flour or clay particles, correct?
That's right. If we want to go back, let's go ahead and jump back then to that previous slide, and we can look at that for a second. It'll give you a sense of the deposit. So I'll let you, Carrie, move the PowerPoint back to that original regional slide.
Oh, I think you got the screen right now. Just hit your left arrow and that'll take us right back there.
Okay, it doesn't want to do that.
Zoom issues.
Yeah, Zoom issues, or it's received the command. No, we're going the wrong direction now. Okay. Let's see.
It's like a grain of sand.
There we go. I don't know.
Or try
Yeah,
your
yeah, we could try this. Mark, why don't you take, yeah, if we do that, then we'll lose my ability to do this, but we need to go.
No worries. I'll take us back. There. Let's start back here, and I'll
Yeah,
give it back to you.
there we go. Now let's look at this. So back to the regional slide, and we can go ahead and the idea of having floodwaters move down here into south central Washington and being backed up behind Wallula Gap, the water levels are going to remain high for probably about 2 weeks. And during that time, you can see the Snake River over here. The Snake River, in fact, was flowing the other direction for a while. It was flowing, rather than flowing towards the confluence with the Columbia, it was moving to the east. Even there was, and it was, again, it effectively, it submerged the entirety of the Columbia River. But with that, we generate these deposits that are very fine grained, and we call them rhythmites, and named, or tushy beds, named after the town of Tushy, Washington. But Mark, you were asking about the gravels. If we get closer here to the Spokane area, we would find extensive areas of gravel deposits that were dropped very early on by the floods. The finer grained sedimentary particles tended to be transported down around past the Hanford area, or they moved through Cheney, Washington, and down the Cheney-Palouse Scabland tract. Always, and all of them kind of came together here in the Pasco, Kennewick area.
So some of the bluffs that you see above the Spokane River around Spokane, those are gravelly, and those would have been the result of these floods, correct?
Or they were scoured, and I'm not sure. The bluffs as we come into town from the south on Highway 195, and people have built all their expensive homes, those are in fact finer grained flood deposits, because as the waters kind of wrap around Spokane, they started to flow backwards up Latah Creek. And so we would see the evidence of the pulses of flooding that we have there. Many of the terraces that you would encounter if you were to move directly or drive from Spokane, for example, to the Grand Coulee, those have been scoured by some of the floods that move through there, because the waters really split. Some went to Grand Coulee, some went down here on the Cheney-Palouse Scabland tract.
All right. And I know from experience of my own that a lot of those well-drained sediments are also going to have specialized flora. You're going to have a lot of the desert parsleys, you're going to have sand dropseed, you're going to have other plants that are highly adapted to a well-drained substrate. So these floods really had far-reaching consequences for the vegetation.
Absolutely. Okay, so if we can move to the next slide, let's see, maybe it'll allow me to do that. Nope.
I think you got to take control again. You might have to click on.
Okay. Okay.
We're getting the hang of this Zoom thing.
Yeah, we will sort it out. Okay. I think everybody's using Zoom at the same time, and it's really slowing things down.
That totally could be, yeah.
Okay.
All right.
There we go. Okay, so now we're about 20 kilometers, 12 miles, 12 miles or so northeast of Pasco. These are Juniper Dunes, Bureau of Land Management. It's a wilderness area that you're only allowed to get in there about 1 month out of the year. There's tremendous concern by the dryland wheat farmers in the area for people going in and starting a range fire. But there are other times in the year I think they just like to have it quiet. Nevertheless, it is a place where you can go and wander around. The dunes are are fascinating. I've had I tried to explain it to people. I guess I've always had a kind of a Lawrence of Arabia complex, and I've always enjoyed wandering up and down the dunes. Some people like to take their snowboards and slide down the slip faces on the steep downwind sides of these dunes. There are a number of different dunes in the area you can kind of see. Let's see if I can get the control. I'm not sure if I can get that mouse to behave for us. Maybe not. But I've identified some of the dune shapes that we have, the morphologies, and the mean prevailing wind. Now I say mean because in fact these sand dunes are really funky. These are the most complicated winds, particularly at the downwind end of the Juniper dunes, that I've ever encountered. And I've been studying dunes all over the world and all over the Western United States for about the last 45 years. There are dunes that develop where people go in with their ATVs and they disrupt the vegetation at the surface. A lot of it's cheatgrass. Cheatgrass is, for early in the season, tends to hold the dune sand in place, but you can have blowout dunes, so-called because they do kind of look like blown out or blown up craters, and then they move downwind. And we can see in this area, get a sense, I don't know, is my pointer showing that at all, Mark?
Not yet, but I can indicate.
There we go. Okay, there you are. There, those would be the blowout dunes. And they're very closely related to something here that they look like hairpins. Down here, I've pointed out a couple of them. One is pointing at the nose on the right-hand side. One is pointing at a limb. Looks like hairpins, and these are vegetation-controlled dunes where the limbs point in the upwind direction, and we call those parabolic dunes. For your information, and by the way, the entirety of the very active part of the Juniper Dunes is only about 30 square kilometers. The area that's covered with some form of dune sand, including blowout dunes and so forth, is a little bit in excess of 50 square kilometers. The dune sands are, as far as we can tell, are tens of meters thick at their thickest. There's places where in between dunes, you can get down to the substrate, which is previous flood deposits or windblown silt. Now, the most active part of the Juniper Dunes are these dunes that look very much like a, see if it's gonna, right up in here, the transverse dunes. And you can see those are more or less perpendicular to the prevailing wind. Things are starting to swirl around here, but if you have this ridge line, which is more or less at right angles to the prevailing wind, they happen to be called transverse dunes. They form when there's enough dune sand to have a continuous ridge. But many of them have more of a crescent shape, and these are parts of so-called Barkhan dunes. So they're crescent shaped. They go by various names. Lunate dunes, but Barkhan is probably the most common that you'd see. And Mark has wandered into these dunes. I have sampled and looked at grain size across the entirety of the dune area. And there's a general tendency for the grain sizes to become finer, from moving from fine grained sand at the upwind end to very fine sand at the downwind end. And as we get up towards the tip, very close to where we can see the dryland farms, it makes a clockwise turn. And something is happening to the wind in this area, which is causing, and we'll see that in our next slide, where we can see that there are a number of different prevailing wind directions. And it gets into dune mechanics, but what's interesting from our point, or from your point of view of looking at vegetation, is there's certain parts of the dune, the upwind side of the dune, that's going to be susceptible to more erosion. And the vegetation, some of the early stabilizing plants like the Oryzopsis hymeneoides, it's Indian rice grass, will try to establish itself here and do reasonably well, but then it gets undercut. It's places on the downwind side that theoretically places where where sand will accumulate, but there the problem is that if it's a steep enough angle on the downwind side, then it will be a slip face. And again, the plants won't be able to get their roots in and be able to successfully survive the area. But over a long period of time, and with the introduction, I'm not sure when that happened, of the juniper, this area has been relatively stable. If you were to look at the long-term average of migration from where these sand particles started around Pasco to where they sit today, they were moving at only about a centimeter per decade. Again, that's a centimeter per decade is just a kind of, and it's a very gross sort of a calculation. There were probably times when these dunes moved much more rapidly, on the order of meters per year. So we're dealing with, overall, there's a large conveyor belt where sediment is provided down in the Pasco area. And then begins to move back to the northeast as part of that conveyor belt, moving back towards Spokane, but very slowly if you're a sand-sized particle. But because we do have silt and clay mixed in, then we can generate dust clouds from places like this that are accumulating in the wheat fields, in the agricultural lands to the northeast. I think that's the big picture of what we're looking at for these dune sands. And so how old are they? Well, they only started to migrate in this area after about 14,500 years ago. So we know they're younger than that. If you dig down into some of these dunes, there are places where the dunes had buried Mazama tephra, which is about 8,000 years ago when the Mount Mazama ash was accumulating in this area. So we find those sorts of things, but these are geologically very recent features. And the next time we have a glaciation and we have more glacial outbursts, mega floods, all of this is going to be washed clear. There won't be any evidence that it was ever here. So this is a very, as far as agricultural lands, these are very sensitive lands, very easily remobilized. If you have situations like in the blowout dunes, people go out there with their ATVs, or if it was a grazing land and they were to disrupt the surface cover, then you can remobilize that surface. So Mark, what are your questions?
Well, I just had a comment that this geologically very active or relatively active sort of substrate creates special opportunities for plants that couldn't compete in other places. And you mentioned the Indian rice grass. That's an example of one, or the veiny dock. And I'll be showing some photos later of plants that really are fairly obligate in these really dynamic sedimentary situations. That if we somehow miraculously stabilize this whole place so that the dunes didn't move anymore, overall biodiversity would actually decrease. And that wouldn't be a good outcome for regional biodiversity, to lose these sand dune species like scurf pea or the yellow wild rye or some of the other plants that we're going to look at later.
Yeah, I have seen buckwheat out here, and obviously this is a shrub steppe. We have Artemisia sagebrush out here as well. There's even a sensitive plant I was telling you about, a cryptantha, gray cryptantha that has, and it also likes very well drained and dynamic soils like this, which it likes to have sand grains blowing around it, and it survives very well actually if it isn't buried too deeply. Okay, well, let's look at the last of our slides, and we can see what and these last two images, or the last two slides, have been oblique, obviously, and thanks to Google Earth for being able to do this. But we can see this steep side of the sand dunes, which again, is the slip face. And so sediment will be blown over the top. I've seen in places where there's rumex that you will find along these slopes, and we'll get the some of the tumbleweed will find itself being carried over the top and kind of gets trapped here. And we find that throughout the Columbia Basin. But notice in particular, I've got a number of arrows here, 3 arrows, starting with the one on the left. You can see more or less where that slip face is perpendicular to the wind direction. So that's, you see, the dunes preserve a record of wind directions. And if, as Mark was suggesting, you could stabilize the whole surface, you'd know for a particular time, if you could date how old that surface was, what the wind direction was. But in this area, because we're right at the tip of the Juniper Dunes, something funky is going on here. And I don't know if you can see, it's fairly light, but the wind is, in my middle arrow here, the wind is starting to shift farther to the east. This is the north arrow up here on the upper right. And then finally, we've got the winds have moved more to the northeast. So this just gives you a sense of, again, the dynamics and trying to reconstruct wind history, which is part of, Mark had mentioned that I work with paleoclimate change. So I'm using sand dunes and their orientations, and I, in fact, dig into these dunes. I look at the strata and the cross strata that also are, that also preserve evidence of wind direction. And to a degree, you could even look at this and say something about, if you will, the velocity of wind, although that's not as good as some of the other, as the cross strata, for just saying things that are very basic about wind transport directions. And each one of these darker dots that you see here, these would be, some of the more prominent dark dots are, in fact, some of the juniper that we have out here, as well as a lot of the sage brush and other shrub species. Okay, Mark.
And you can see that those junipers tend to be restricted to the north-facing slip faces. So even the cross-section of the dune itself creates a variable growing environment where the junipers can preferentially establish on the cooler north-facing slopes. So dune morphology really matters here.
And so we would see that particularly on that the previous slide where we were looking at, there was a whole area. It may well be that the juniper was there and the dune field has migrated around where the juniper sit. There are a number of, there's so much that we don't know really about the juniper dunes. My interest in the area, I wanted to see what the grain sizes told us about the transport directions and the transport history. And in fact, the grain sizes do also indicate that there is transport to the east, just like what the morphologically what we're seeing for those features. So it's very much emphasized both by the grain sizes you see. They become even more fine-grained towards the north and northeast as you move up across the dune field. Any other questions, Mark?
No, I think that's a really excellent insight into where these dunes came from and the specialized kind of environment or substrate that they provide, and that they're also worthy of conservation, setting aside some of these things where we don't have impacts associated with off-road vehicles or with grazing and other land uses. That this is an environmental type that is worthy of its own kind of conservation. So David, thank you so much for your time and for helping introduce us into these specialized arid land environments. And hopefully we'll get you back in for a conversation in the future.
Okay, it was my pleasure. Thanks, and yeah, good luck with this. Such a fascinating area.